slides. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Okay.
All right. Well, we're all getting situated. Welcome, everyone, to our session on crisis communication. My name is Christy. I work with Go Western Newfoundland, and on behalf of the National PD Committee, Tanya and Gabby are on this session, and Nadine, welcome to today's session. The session is being recorded and will be available to view later on the TMAC website, like all of the virtual PD sessions that we do. There will be time for questions at the end. So if you would like, please feel free to drop them in the chat as you think of them, and we'll make sure to answer them at the end. So let's face it, nobody really wants to talk about a crisis. However, it's crucial for destinations, hotels, and attractions to proactively address crisis planning to ensure swift and effective responses when unexpected challenges arise. We are really fortunate today to have Kathy Priest, Senior Vice President of Tourism Public Relations with Development Counselors International, DCI for short, with us today. Kathy oversees communication strategy for tourism public relations clients, directs communication for tourism crisis response and crisis recovery efforts, and leads the agency's hospitality strategy. In the past 20 years, Kathy has worked with numerous destinations, hotels, and top travel and lifestyle brands worldwide. She has played an integral role in helping clients navigate challenging situations and emerge stronger, guiding them through nearly every type of crisis, from hurricanes to pandemics to crime. In doing so, Kathy has become an advocate for developing and maintaining a comprehensive crisis communications plan to ensure clients are ready, not if, but when a crisis strikes. So, Kathy, welcome. Thanks for being here, and I'll send it over to you.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you for having me. That was a great introduction. Yeah, I think I might have to skip a couple of slides now that you said so much about me. That was fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and welcome everybody to our session on best practices in crisis communications. As Christy was saying, this is one of those things that you hope you never have to be involved in, but in reality, we know that crisis is inevitable. So hopefully this will help you be a little bit more prepared, not if, but when the situations happen. So as Christy was saying, I'm Kathy, Senior Vice President of PR for tourism for DCI. Yes, it's been more than 20 years. You can probably tell I've been through several crises by all the gray hairs on my head as a result. We've worked with destinations, cruise lines, different lifestyle brands, guiding them through various types of challenges. And it's really made me an advocate and passionate about doing crisis communications, being prepared, looking at all the phases of crisis and what you need to look at here from a destination side so that you're fully prepared when, not if, a crisis strikes. So here's what we're going to talk to a little bit today. What do I need in my crisis communications plan? I'm going to tell you a little bit about DCI itself to start. Then we're going to look at what to say. How do you decide when to say? What comes after? What do you do when you're in the recovery phase? And a little Q&A. I also dropped in a little surprise case study here that kind of illustrates kind of what I'm going to talk you through. And then just as a quick reminder, this session is mostly designed with PR practitioners, tourist boards, hotels, the industry side of the business here, but we also hope that this session will still resonate with media for several reasons. We hope that it will help you to better understand how organizations respond during a crisis, and that will give you a little bit more insight on what's going on the other side that will help you provide more accurate, contextualized type of reporting. Also, it will illustrate a little bit about storytelling narratives. So you'll be better able to recognize the many stories that often come out of a crisis. As you know, there are often stories about people helping other people, stories about resilience, stories about community response. So there's something to be gained here as well. And then also open collaboration and communication builds that trust between organizations and media. And we're hoping that that will help to foster some stronger partnerships moving ahead, ensuring accurate, timely information, all good things, and sharing. So a little bit about DCI. Who are we as an agency? DCI was founded back in 1960 with a focus on economic developments. But because tourism is a major source of economic development for destinations around the globe, it became a natural evolution to also develop a tourism practice. And over the years, we've worked with more than 500 places around the globe, as well as many hotels, attractions, tourism companies. We like to say we are passionate about places. We've worked with over 85 different people here, and our offices are in New York, Denver, and our Canadian staff are based throughout Canada, in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. Our business is actually, we are a women-owned business. While this was a family-based agency for many years, the president of our tourism practice, Carolee Barnes, and the president of our economic development practice, Julie Curtin, joined together to buy him out and go through the process to officially become a certified women-owned business. So we're proud of that fact. Things we do at DCI, aside from tourism PR and obviously economic development, our services span a wide gamut, from talent attraction to digital advertising, public relations, research. We've even got some airlift route development specialties in there. And why this is important is, even though today's discussion is about crisis communications, it's important to understand that our staff specializes in the same things that destinations and hotels and other tourism entities do, and spanning all of this. So we know not just how crisis impacts consumer perception, but also how a meeting planner might perceive a destination or a hotel, or how hospitality investment decisions might be made. So that's just a little bit of a context in terms of how DCI approaches things. So getting into the meat of our proposal, what do we need in a crisis communications plan? I know this is one of the things that you specifically wanted me to answer as part of this. Obviously, crisis plan development is very complex, but I'll take you through some of what you need to get started. So as a refresher, or for anyone who's new to PR or crisis communications, we want to look at what defines crisis communications. As a refresher, in sum, it is any type of not routine event that risks negative publicity for a brand and can potentially damage a brand's reputation. So that could be anything from a natural disaster to a hurricane to a flood to crime to politics. Today's landscape is very complex. These kind of emergencies can come from anywhere at any time and have severe impact to your brand image and viability. So that's why having a great plan and really looking at crisis communications is important. So at DCI, we believe that a good crisis framework is built on three core pillars of crisis communications, or phases, if you will. That is preparation, response, and recovery. So essentially the before, during, and after when a crisis strikes. Each element is crucial because you want to look at crisis communications from a holistic framework, not just in and of itself or in one piece. Okay, I have a crisis plan, I'm in great shape. Not necessarily. You really have to look at the whole way that a crisis plays out to be able to better understand it and deal with it when it happens. So preparedness, and excuse me while I soothe a sore throat, preparedness is not reactive. You have to anticipate what's coming down the road. Look at potential threats, have a plan in place. So to help illustrate that, I'm gonna throw out a quote from one of my favorite movies. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called The American President. And there is a scene in it when There is crisis in the White House, and the White House press secretary says, "Oh my gosh, the important thing is not to look like we're panicking." The president looks at her and goes, "Actually, I think the important thing is not to be panicking." So the point of that is, if you have a really good crisis plan in place, there's no reason to look like you're panicking or be panicking, because you'll be prepared in advance to handle what's coming your way. Then, looking at today's connected world, we know that the crisis can impact in minutes. So what really matters is not if a crisis will occur, but how best you're prepared to manage it when it does. So through our work, we've seen that those destinations and organizations with really strong crisis frameworks can better deal with crises, recover faster, and maintain their audience's trust even during the most challenging times, which is the main goal here in crisis communication. So as a best practice, let's look at that. What is the main goal? You want to maintain, establish, or recover trust in your brand. That is the main point. Then when you're looking at the strategic response pillar here, that's talking about, obviously, response. So what do you say? It's imperative to respond swiftly, strategically, and decisively to protect your brand reputation. When a crisis strikes, there is very little, if any, margin for error. So having a good crisis communications plan with a strong framework and a framed out response is imperative in terms of talking to your audience. And the third part is recovery. What happens as you're coming out of that crisis? How do you talk about your organization? What does it look like? How do you ensure that the crisis narrative does not continue? And how do you communicate that, yes, it is safe to come here. Yes, we are past this crisis. How do we keep moving forward? So those are the three pillars that we're going to kind of touch on as we go through the presentation today. Preparation. This is my big thing here. Prepare, prepare, prepare. Brands who are prepared can deal with any crisis. So what do we want to do? There are a number of elements that are going to go into your crisis plans. First and foremost, you want to identify the organizations that are involved and the roles that each of those organizations have. There will be different organizations who will support crisis communications, response, and recovery whenever a crisis strikes. And there needs to be close coordination and collaboration between them. More than likely in a crisis, you're going to have some form of emergency management entity that's involved. Excuse me there. So they're going to be primarily concerned with dealing with the immediate crisis itself in the short term. If it's crime, handling the crime. If it's, a hurricane, it's cleaning up the disaster and helping people. Yeah. Then on the other side, you have the actual communications teams, your marketing people, your PR people, your leadership, who are actually doing the communicating about the crisis. So it's important to identify roles and understand the difference between crisis management also and crisis response. So crisis management is actually managing the choices that an organization makes when there is a critical turning point, versus crisis response, which is what an organization does, says, and when in response to a crisis. So it's a little bit of a different thing, and that's kind of where we're going to be focusing here. Then a good crisis plan also needs to identify your key audiences and your stakeholders, because there are always multiple in a crisis. Are you talking to media and their audiences? Are you talking to, let's say if you're a DMO, you also have stakeholders, hoteliers and tour operators and businesses who work within the destination. So you need to identify who they are and who you're speaking to in order to determine what crisis response is going to look like. And a good crisis response has to address the needs of any and all stakeholders who are impacted. So different audiences are going to be looking for different messages. So as another best practice right here, tailoring messages to each group is a best practice to ensure that you're providing the relevant information that addresses the needs of each group. Next, the plan should set protocols and procedures to ensure clear and effective communication at the right time with the right key messages, as you're moving forward to ensure that communication during a crisis is smooth, effective, maintains the positive reputation of a brand, and ensures a cohesive response among all the agencies that are involved. So finally, then we know when providing crisis teams and key spokespeople, we have to give them clear guidelines on how to respond to different types of crisis and who to contact for support. That's critical. So these are the key elements that you want to get into any type of crisis communications plan. Further to that, in addition to addressing various audiences and stakeholders, a good crisis plan should also address the needs of different types of scenarios, whether it's hurricanes, political discord, natural disasters, you name it. So further to tailoring your messages to specific audiences, it's also a best practice to craft sample messages and statements in advance for different types of crisis that can impact your brand. I know this probably sounds like a lot. It is. Crisis preparation, crisis management, a lot goes into it to ensure that you're in a good place to be able to handle the crisis when it does impact. So say, for example, if your organization is facing a hurricane, you should have a sample statement about that talks about how we're dealing with the hurricane, how we stand, how we sit, and have that specific message also then tailored to all those different audiences. So yes, it is a lot, but being able to plug in those details and have that prepared, have those templates prepared in advance will allow you to more rapidly deal with a crisis and respond effectively and quickly when it comes in. Because if you have those templates in place, you can just easily plug in those details, and then there's not a delay in your response time. So how else can you prepare? Further to having this plan and these templates in place for various scenarios, what else needs to be done? Because it's not just the plan, right? Obviously, you need to understand the plan. You need to know the plan. So what else can you do? Select your spokespeople in advance. Don't wait until the crisis hits to say, this is who's going to talk about it. That's another place where you can prepare in advance. And then how do you select those spokespeople? You want to make sure that you're selecting the right spokespeople. So your plan should also think about the criteria that you want in a spokesperson. For example, are there bilingual skills needed? Or is this person a confident speaker? Can this person maintain calm under pressure? Do they have the relevant expertise to the crisis? And do they understand the organization's value to be able to communicate that properly when speaking with media and other key audiences? Secondarily, and this is another one that literally we could go into layers and layers and layers, provide training. Your crisis response teams need training. Practice, whether it be attending a webinar like this one or doing spokesperson media training. There's plenty of different training sessions that could be done to ensure that you're ready no matter the scenario when crisis hits, and make sure that you're ready to activate those crisis protocols and plans when it's ready. And then it's also important, another best practice, establish contact in advance with the various emergency management organizations that are involved in those crises. So let's say, for example, it's a healthcare pandemic. You want to be speaking to the chief medical officer in advance so that you have those protocols in place and your teams can coordinate seamlessly and effectively when a crisis hits. So now that we've determined a plan and we're looked at some of the best practices that we can do in advance, what happens when a crisis hits? How do I best respond? And what do I say? So essentially, this part is moving into the second pillar or phase of the crisis. So you might be wondering, what's next? How do I respond? Can that be determined? How do I figure out what to say and when to say it? Actually, it's a relatively simple formula. I don't want to oversimplify, but it is a lot of people tend to overthink it, and it's really something that can be answered by 4 simple questions. The 4-question test. If the answer to any one of these is yes, you probably need to respond. There's always little nuances and tweaks in here, and I'll get into that too. But the number one priority, keeping in mind, is that you want to maintain, establish, or recover trust in your brand. Is to ask question one: are those stakeholders whose trust matter to me? Are they expecting me to respond? Am I expected to say something about this crisis? Do I own this crisis? The second question helps you determine if remaining silent is in the best interest of your brand. Some people think, oh, if I don't say anything about it, the crisis will blow over and it'll be all done. Well, no, unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Silence is not always golden. In fact, it can be interpreted negatively. And at worst, it could be considered like an affirmation of guilt, which is absolutely not what you want. It can also allow media or adversaries, other outside organizations, to define the crisis, as well as your organization's motives and actions, which is not what you want. In a crisis situation, you want to be managing that narrative to ensure that your brand reputation stays protected. So looking at questions 3 and 4, we know that whoever is first to define the crisis, the organization's motives and its action, is the one who controls the interpretation of the event. Is it your fault? Is it not? So when we're not the first to speak about a crisis, we have to act even more quickly, because the longer it takes for an organization to respond, the harder it gets to have people believe that the organization actually cares. So these are the things that you don't want to happen. So if your answer to any one of these questions is yes, you should probably respond. But that being said, don't assume all eyes are on you. It's not always the case. It's different when the crisis is out there in the media already and people are coming to you saying this happened, it's being reported on. But sometimes organizations think there's a crisis where there is none. For example, I'll give you a case in point. Back in the early 2000s, New Orleans was ranked by the FBI as having one of the highest homicide rates in the country. As a result, local tourism and government officials were concerned about New Orleans' reputation, and they wanted to address that. They wanted to combat that perception and tell the outside world, including the media, that this is not the case. However, looking at media coverage out there and discussing with other entities, this was not the perception that was actually out there. So by doing so, if New Orleans would have gone ahead and addressed the situation, they would have been creating a crisis and a negative image of themselves where none existed. So it's important to always look, check the media, do your homework, know what's out there, know what's being said about you. We must always recommend not making assumptions. Don't ensure that, yes, here's our negative story, we're putting it out there for you. No, you don't want to do that. Check the media, make sure the crisis exists before you respond. Don't create it if it isn't there. So looking at response itself, there are some key considerations when you're thinking about what does that actual response look like. Throughout every phase of a crisis, there are core principles guiding our actions. So we need to think about, A, do we express genuine concern? Collaborating with other agencies, being transparent, super important, can't emphasize that enough, especially as it comes to building trust and managing the narrative. And then as crisis practitioners, we know that as you're moving through the various phases of a crisis, the messaging is going to change. It's going to look different at the beginning of a crisis when things have just happened, and very different towards the end of that crisis as you're transitioning into recovery. And then in recovery is another message altogether. So it's really important for practitioners and people who are working within crisis communications to stay flexible, be able to adapt messaging and change as the situation evolves. So once determining that a statement is needed, this is more of what to say, just in a little bit more depth here. Best practices there are 5 basic elements that you want in any type of media statement or interview, anything that you're saying in response to a crisis. The first thing, first and foremost, is to acknowledge that the crisis took place and that you're aware of it. Second most important is you never want to minimize anyone's pain or suffering. All crisis related communications should express empathy in any event that someone has been negatively impacted in some way by a crisis situation, whether that's an injury or perhaps her purse got stolen. Anything that impacts a person can't be just brushed aside. It has to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed up front for good crisis communications. So then the messaging also needs to express what the organization cares about. What are the values? For example, as it pertains to the crisis, an agency could say, ensuring the safety of visitors and locals alike is of paramount importance to us. So you want to define that, and then you want to you want to tell them what you're doing to address the crisis. So not just, we know the crisis is here, we feel empathy towards those who it's impacted. This is what matters to us, but this is what we're doing proactively to address the situation, and what are the next steps that are coming up. So what are we doing next? And also, most importantly, where can you get more information to find out what to do in this crisis and how it impacts you? Little bit of tips and tricks. Media interviews and press briefings. So this particular slide is not just for our travel related organizations, but also for media here in the call. Media have very specific needs when it comes to a crisis situation. So it's important to understand what those are when you're preparing to speak with the media or otherwise respond, whether it's in a press briefing, an interview, a statement. You want to understand the audience. You want to also be sure to determine the journalist outlet so you can tailor responses for that particular audience. So for example, what you're saying to a journalist, even though you have a consistent message, it may look a little bit different if you're talking to the Globe and Mail or a CBC News versus, hey, I'm writing for Travel Week or Canadian Travel Press. Those trade journalists versus consumer journalists, they have different needs. Know that audience, know what their needs are, so that then you can frame your response in a context that will be most relevant to them and their readers. And then guess what? Rehearse Q&A. You want to be prepared. So develop a list of potential questions. What might the journalist ask? What would my answers be? Frame them out. You can think of various scenarios, various situations that a journalist might ask, which is terrific. And it's okay to ask, to get those questions in advance. Even if a journalist says no, that they're not going to provide it, then you still have a chance to go back, think about it, frame out your response accordingly. Even if they just give general direction in terms of what they want to speak about, that will help you formulate your approach to that response. So formulate your own list of questions, prepare in advance. We like to say rehearse in front of a mirror, rehearse in front of a person, know the journalist, know what they report about. Also, know their style of reporting. Some journalists are very hard hitting. Other journalists might focus on a particular aspect of a crisis. Maybe their interest is not so much in how it impacts a destination, but how it impacts those living in the destination. So if you know what the journalist is looking to do, if you know their style, if you know them personally, if you've done your homework and researched past articles that those journalists have written about, that's a best practice. And then we also like to say, plan for the worst, because no matter how many great plans and you might have your questions, there's always going to be a journalist who throws out the most embarrassing, difficult, or even threatening question that even a tough and seasoned spokesperson could have trouble handling. So when you're looking to speak to people, this is what we recommend in terms of best practices. Moving forward, the crisis is over. Now what do I do? So looking ahead, we're going into the third pillar of crisis communications here. And there are absolutely things you can do to help ensure a very strong recovery as you're building back better, because that's the goal. You want to get that trust in your organization, and you want to come out of this stronger, if possible, than you went into it. So, best practices to emerge stronger. What do you want to say? What is it that you want to communicate? In the post crisis phase, and while you're recovering, the goal is to rebuild trust and confidence, as I said several times. I can't emphasize that enough. But throughout this phase, the overarching messages need to convey whether or not you were affected by the crisis. If you were, what strides have you made towards recovery? One of the first things that you want to let stakeholders and various audiences know, especially if there was some sort of closure or disruption that happened, is hello, we're open, come back, stay with us. If you're a hotel, visit us. If you're a DMO, whatever that might be, you want to encourage that you are open, you are welcoming people, and that you're encouraging their business. And then it's also important to maintain transparency about the status of your recovery. For example, and I'll just throw this one out there, it was someone that I had worked with years ago. Let's say you're a hotel who's experienced significant beach erosion as a result of a storm. You don't want to go out there and tell your audiences that your beach is fine, even if that's your main hotel selling point, because if not, guess what? Those audiences are quickly going to learn the truth. So it's important to maintain honesty and transparency as you're communicating. Consider using photos, videos, live webcams to show how you're recovering and those steps that you're taking to build back better, stronger. Maintain a regular flow of communication. That's key to building trust. Develop a cadence and remain consistent, adjusting frequency as you move through the phases of the crisis. So, for example, you may need to be communicating more frequently as recovery is beginning. And then as you're getting towards the end, that cadence may be able to dial down slowly over time. What you also want to do is highlight narratives, positive narratives, the best thing to do after a crisis. You want to talk positively about what your organization does. You want to ensure that your organization is being portrayed in a positive light. So in the case of the aforementioned hotel that had beach erosion and subsequent restoration, they were terrified that that was going to impact bookings, occupancy, and spend in the immediate or near term. So what they needed to do to try to help avoid any cancellations or postponements of guest stays, we took that messaging and crafted it very carefully. So we emphasized that, yes, some sections of the beach will be closed from time to time, but it gave us the opportunity to spin a little bit different narrative. We were able to talk about the beach. Yes, it's still here, but we have all these restaurants, we have family-friendly activities, we have all these wonderful facilities, and maybe if a section of the beach is closed, we have 3 beachfront pools that are open all the time. So it allowed for the narrative for us to shift the narrative for the hotel and tell a bigger story besides it just being so much about the beach. So it built more interest ultimately in their product and gained a really great opportunity to talk about the hotel in different ways. To that end, you also want to consider a dedicated campaign, if you can do it, rather than, perhaps just a press release or a media visit. Create a campaign specifically dedicated to recovery with use different tools in your marketing toolkit to get there, whether it's a press trip or speaking to travel agents or travel newsletters. You really look at all the tools that you have in your toolkit and get them all to speak about the same thing. This is how we're recovering. This is how we're building back. This is what's important to know. As an example, I'm throwing in a little bit of a case study here. This was something that DCI had worked on for our Greater Miami clients. For many years, they had significant challenges during this annual events with spring break. And after several years of incidents with spring break, they became under really, really heightened scrutiny with public safety concerns. So we had to lead the development and implementation of their crisis communication strategy. And things intensified with the introduction of new regulations that the city called their spring breakup campaign. So what do you do when there is such a risk? We had to very carefully strike a very delicate balance. So we needed to support those necessary safety measures that were put in place while simultaneously maintaining tourism throughout the broader destination beyond the beach, which is where the majority of the incidents were happening. So what did we do? DCI's strategy. We developed a dual-pronged strategy for Greater Miami. Foundationally, we centered on crisis preparation and management. We ensured that we were monitoring, listening. This is key in terms of knowing what messages are out there about your destination. And we were doing it well in advance of spring break. And then those insights gained from our monitoring informed the development of our crisis communications plan. So that's a best practice. Listen, apply. This plan also established a crisis team that worked across agencies. So it brought together not just the Greater Miami CVB, but city officials, the mayor's office, Miami-Dade County representatives. So as I was speaking about earlier, it's important to have those connections with those other agencies that are involved in the crisis so that you can ensure that you're coordinated, you're communicating, coordinated messaging, everything is going out there with a unified voice. So that command structure, scenario-based protocols, we created those as well to ensure swift responses to any situations that might have arisen. And we undertook a proactive media relations campaign. What did that look like? We spotlighted Greater Miami beyond the beach. Similar to what I had spoken about with my hotel example just a few minutes ago, we were able to take a very proactive approach and launch a strategic media relations campaign that showcased Greater Miami beyond the beach. So we did a satellite media tour that highlighted other neighborhoods like Little Havana and Wynwood, and we were able to showcase art, culture, cuisine as reasons to visit. And by proactively promoting this across Greater Miami, we were able to effectively diversify and disperse the visitation throughout Greater Miami beyond the beach, and that reduced pressure on the area that was having the problems and having this sensitive period. And as you can see, we got a lot of coverage from it from various types of Miami magazines and various types of outlets, including broadcasts through NSMC. So what was the results? Really, really great. We had this comprehensive type of approach that we took generated significant results. Fortunately, Miami's new regulations resulted in fewer disturbances. Those visitors were dispersed throughout Miami. So they were very grateful to see a 26% reduction in arrests in that year that we undertook. And in the meantime, having more visitors spread throughout Miami allowed for a greater impact to those businesses outside of the beach, those restaurants, those hotels, those attractions, and really told a bigger story about who Miami is as a destination beyond spring break. So most importantly, we help the destination support recovery, support safety measures, and we were also able at the same time to protect its reputation as a premier visitor destination. With that, I am going to open up the floor for questions and answers because I know we have about not too much time left, about 15 minutes. So I know I covered a lot in a very brief period of time. So please, I would love to hear any questions you might have about crisis communications and the things we've covered today.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathy. Does anyone have a question?
Best crisis activations, any questions about what goes into a plan or when to determine response, the 4 questions that you need to ask yourself?
Kathy, I think that was really well done. Thank you. I have a question for you.
Yes.
With all of the, I mean, they were good examples, but like, do you foresee any potential crises that, like, as tourism, professionals, like, do you foresee anything in the next year or so that we should be mindful of? Not that you have to address it and give us solutions, but just like things that we should probably watch out for that you think would be coming in the next year or so?
All trends are pointing towards positive recovery, that tourism is continuing to bounce back, that people are continuing to travel, that people are continuing to spend. There is in the very short term some research that holiday travel is down for this year. So if you're a destination or a hotel or any tourism related business, understand that I think the figure was about 18% down over last year. So just something to look at in the very short term, um, as far as threats go.
Thank you. Yeah, I just thought it's interesting to make note of, especially as we saw the big news or all the kind of craziness that's happening with the Canadian government right now, and like seeing that holiday travel is down for Canada because of essentially how our economy is performing. So that's good to know, and some of the stuff that we learned today, I feel like we should like apply that as we're thinking about how to target Canadian travelers. So yeah, thanks
Yeah,
for that.
and what's important too is I know that research has been showing that international travel from Canada is actually up. Domestic is a little bit down within Canada, so that's something to look at for your domestic destinations, whether it's Montreal or Quebec or Toronto, wherever you might be. That domestic is a little bit down year over year, but international travel is up.
Nice.
We do have a question in the chat, Kathy.
Oh, fabulous.
Advice on stakeholder engagement. Who should you reach out to and who should you ignore? I realize it's fairly general and would be crisis specific.
It would be, yes, indeed. But really, you need to be holistic when you're looking at stakeholders. Say, if you're a DMO, you're looking at the hotels that are operating. You're looking at your convention center, if you have one in your particular area. You're looking at restaurants, all types of different businesses that a visitor might patronize. And who are those? Who are they? They also media are can be considered a stakeholder. What are their needs? What do they need to know? So you really need to consider and do a deep dive analysis to make sure that you're paying attention to each one of them, that you're accurately listing who your stakeholders are in your plan. So it's a little bit different, yes, for different crises. It's a little bit different for different organizations. But mainly it's any business that's involved in tourism, if you're a DMO,
Awesome.
directly or indirectly.
Perfect. I actually have a question from my perspective. We are a small DMO, only 2 staff, but we do have a board of directors. I am curious if there is an incident or a crisis, if it should be the board of directors, the chair, or the staff person, or does that depend, like the executive director, does that depend on the crisis as well that should be speaking on behalf of the organization?
Well, that's something that there are a lot of different criteria that go into choosing. Generally, you do want the leader of the organization as the spokesperson, but you also have to think, is that person the best possible spokesperson? Do they have the knowledge of the organization that's needed to be able to respond in case they get a question? Are they able to communicate the organization's values correctly? Do they have a experience in dealing with crisis? Are they going to resonate with media? How do they present? Are they calm? Can they speak to people? You don't want someone who's going to get speaky or not look flustered on camera. If you're dealing with a crisis, you want somebody who is calm and collected in a crisis. So yes, normally it would be like your executive director, but in some cases that may not be the case. Or in other cases, yes, it's the executive director. We just need to add some more training so that the person is properly prepared to be able to speak to audiences in a crisis.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Folks, any other questions? Either you can speak up or you can put it in the chat if you'd prefer.
We might get some who weren't able to join today, who will listen to the recording, might ask some questions, Kathy. We can follow up with you on that too.
That would be fine. I'm happy to take follow-up questions as well.
Awesome. We have a thank you. Great presentation.
Oh, thank you.
So thanks to everyone. Thank you so much, Kathy. We really appreciate your time and certainly your expertise. You have a lot of it. And thank you to everyone for joining us today and for the questions. Reminder that this session has been recorded and will be available on the TMAC website. And you will receive a survey about this session. So please take a moment to give us your feedback about it. And thanks again to everyone and happy holidays. All the best for 2025 to everyone.
Thank
Happy
you.
holidays,
Happy
guys.
holidays,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thanks,
And
everyone.
Hey.
yes.
Happy holidays. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.